Alright, let's go over the general anatomy of the digestive tract. So this image was taken from wikiversity.org, and it's kind of a somewhat simplified version of the digestive tract. In reality, some of these things are a little more squished together. These have been pulled apart a little to make it easier to tell what's connected to what. So we would normally start up here in the oral cavity. Here the lips separate the outside world from the oral cavity. You can also see the teeth there. And then the tongue. So this food normally goes into this hole, the mouth. Technically, you could put food into the nose, which would lead into the nasal cavity, which does connect to the oral cavity back at the oropharynx, but that is generally not considered the correct place to put in food. Assuming we're going to do it the normal way, we're going to put food in here, and then using the lips, tongue, and teeth, we're going to kind of squish, crush, grind, and otherwise mash that food into some sort of paste-like material, which we will then swallow. Swallowing is an action where you use mostly the tongue to shape the squished up food into what we call a bolus, and then move that back to the oropharynx. Once the food hits the back of the tongue and the oropharynx, we have a sort of a swallowing reflex that takes over. It's a series of movements in the muscular walls of the pharynx and the back of the tongue that move that food down toward the laryngopharynx. As it moves down, the epiglottis, which in this picture is already closed over the larynx, slides down so that food doesn't go into the larynx, which is there in front of the esophagus. Instead, it slides down into the opening of the esophagus, which is the muscular tube that leads down from the laryngopharynx toward the stomach. The esophagus, the upper two-thirds part of it, is skeletal muscle, and it gradually transitions to smooth muscle by about the lower third. As the food moves down, we have waves of peristalsis, which are waves of contraction of the muscle that start near the top and kind of slide down the tube to help move food down the esophagus toward the stomach. That's one reason why you can actually swallow if you're upside down. This peristalsis will move the food from the mouth toward the stomach, even against the force of gravity, although it is a little harder, especially with liquids. It actually takes a surprisingly long time for the food to get down the esophagus. I don't know if anyone else has had this experience, but if I've swallowed something that I didn't really chew quite enough, for me it's usually pear for some reason, when I swallow that, I can really feel that item moving down the esophagus, and you can count the seconds. Generally it takes about 10 seconds for food to move all the way down the esophagus from the laryngopharynx down to the stomach. So here at the lower part of the esophagus, we have a sphincter that really, it's called the lower esophageal sphincter. Sometimes people will call it the cardiac sphincter because it's positioned more or less around the heart. That sphincter doesn't actually work very well. It doesn't close the esophagus particularly well, which is one of the reasons why the acidic stomach contents do come up into the esophagus in a lot of people. Anyway, the food enters the stomach. The upper parts of the stomach are known as the cardium and the fundus. And as food enters those, the rest of the stomach sort of opens up and allows the food to fall into the stomach. And this food will spend some amount of time in the stomach. The muscular walls of the stomach will squeeze in sort of peristaltic and churning movements to physically squish and mix the food with the acid and enzymes, which we'll talk about later, that come from the glands in the walls of the stomach. And while the food is in there mixing with the acid and enzymes, it becomes sort of a thin, soupy stuff that we call chyme. That chyme stays in there for a while. The stomach can actually expand quite a bit. Normally it's relatively small, but it's quite expandable. It'll hold, when it's fully expanded, about 2 liters of food, which is rather a lot. It's kind of why you can eat a lot of food at once, although you will start to feel uncomfortably full as it stretches out. So, as that chyme has been in there for a while, finally it's going to be passed through the sphincter at the bottom part of the stomach, the pyloric sphincter, into the first part of the small intestine. The first part of the small intestine is called the duodenum. It's the first roughly 12 inches of the small intestine. And it's here that we're going to bring in some other stuff, but I want to mention for a moment that lower sphincter, the pyloric sphincter, actually does work quite well, unlike the lower esophageal sphincter, which tends to let stuff come back out of the stomach. The pyloric sphincter is effective and actually cuts off the stomach from the duodenum until the duodenum will allow materials to exit. And that's where an interesting interplay comes in. We're going to talk about this in more detail later, but the emptying of the stomach into the duodenum is actually controlled by the duodenum. And one of the reasons we have to do that is because the environment of the stomach is so hostile with the strong hydrochloric acid and the protein digesting enzymes that the stomach puts out, that the stomach wall can protect itself from that acid, although even as well protected as it is, stomach lining has to be regenerated every few days. The walls of the duodenum are not as well protected from that. So once the stomach starts to empty and starts to squeeze this acidic chyme into the duodenum, the pyloric sphincter will open, a little bit of contents will enter the duodenum, and then the duodenum communicates back to the stomach saying, okay, stop, no more, and closes that sphincter again and lets the duodenum neutralize and handle that first little bit of food. And then as that gets passed on down to the lower parts of the duodenum, that signal to the stomach ends, and the stomach empties a little more into the duodenum, and the duodenum then signals it, okay, slow down, and then processes that next little bit of food. So the emptying of the stomach is relatively slow and controlled by the duodenum based on what's coming in and how the duodenum can handle it. We'll talk about that more next lecture. In any case, right now, so we've gotten our food from the stomach into the duodenum, and here in the duodenum, we have the entry of two other important things. So here you could see from the pancreas, we have this pancreatic duct, which comes down through the pancreas and is then going to empty here at this little blue dot into the duodenum. But also notice from the liver, we have this bile duct. So bile is a product of bilirubin metabolism, and the liver processes bilirubin into bile, and then that bile travels down the bile duct and will enter into the duodenum there at actually the same place that the pancreatic duct comes in. Both the bile and the pancreatic duct both enter the duodenum there at the duodenal papilla, which is closed off by another sphincter called the sphincter of Oddi. Normally that sphincter is closed, which means that the bile, which is coming from the liver, sort of backs up that bile duct and actually goes back down the other pathway you can see there into the gallbladder, which will then store that bile for a while. And then during digestion, if you bring fats into the duodenum senses the presence of those fats and releases a hormone, cholecystokinin, which causes the gallbladder to constrict, which then squeezes some of that bile down that bile duct and out through that duodenal papilla into the duodenum, where the bile will help with fat digestion. So we're going to talk about more of that in the next lecture when we talk about some of the details about what goes on at these different spots. This is just the overview. So anyway, our duodenum is taking food from the stomach and then bringing in bile and pancreatic enzymes and letting the stomach empty slowly into the duodenum. And then the duodenum will then, using another kind of motility, mix that chyme with bicarbonate from the pancreas, which neutralizes the acid, and digestive enzymes from the pancreas, which start breaking down more of the food molecules, and bile from the liver, which emulsifies the fat. Emulsifying being to break fat globs into smaller fat globs. It's actually a kind of mechanical digestion. So then the duodenum, and then the later parts of the small intestine, this is only labeled ileum, but there is actually, before the ileum, you have an area called the jejunum, although the difference between them is sort of vague. Anyway, all through that small intestine, we are having chemical digestion of the chyme, and then as that chemical digestion breaks the food molecules down into absorbable molecules, most of the small intestine is about absorbing that food. So as we've had our polysaccharides come in, we break those down into monosaccharides and then absorb them into the blood. As our proteins have come through, protein digestion actually starts in the stomach and then continues in the intestine. And once we're down into a few amino acid pieces, we can absorb those through the wall of the intestine. Fats, mostly in the form of triglycerides, are broken down into fatty acids and monoglycerides, which is a glycerol and one fatty acid. That's through pancreatic and, to a lesser degree, stomach and even a little bit of salivary enzymes. Those fats are then absorbed. Those fatty acids and monoglycerides are absorbed. What happens to them is a little more complicated. We're going to get to that in more detail. And nucleic acids are broken up into nucleotides. All of these food molecules are broken up and absorbed along the small intestine. By the time you get to the end of the small intestine, most of the food molecules have been absorbed. What we have left, and this, as we go through the small intestine, we're also reabsorbing some of the water and some of the salts that we secreted along the way. Then, as you get to the end of the small intestine, we have another sort of a sphincter controlling the exit of the small intestine into the cecum, which is the first part of the large intestine. And as our mostly now digested food and what's left of it, some not less absorbable things, pass into the cecum, we're now in the large intestine. The job in the large intestine is mostly to reabsorb the water. So the rest of the water that we've added here gets taken back into the body. Some vitamins, which are not absorbed well in the small intestine, are absorbed here in the large intestine. And here in the large intestine, we have a large population of bacteria, which are symbiotic with humans. So these bacteria are supposed to be there. They live in our large intestine. We want them there because they can digest some things that we can't. So there are some materials from the small intestine that our enzymes can't digest, but the bacteria in your large intestine can. So as they digest some of those materials, their waste products from their metabolism are useful to us. So a classic example of this are what we call insoluble fibers. Insoluble fibers even bacteria can't digest well, but soluble fibers, you find a lot of these, for example, in beans. Our enzymes don't digest those very well, but bacterial enzymes do. So as those materials pass into our large intestine, the bacteria that are living in there can digest those. They profit from them, and then their waste products, for example, some things called, there are small fatty acids and other materials that the bacteria produce that we then do absorb. And so as we take those in, they benefit our health. It seems to be one of the reasons that certain foods with a lot of those soluble fibers, like beans, are particularly good for our health in some ways, because especially if you have the right kind of gut bacteria, their waste products are helpful for us. In any case, so we absorb those bacterial products in the large intestine. By the time you get to the end of the large intestine, that area called the rectum, what's left is just materials we couldn't digest at all. For example, cellulose, that neither we nor our bacteria can digest that well. Other undigestible materials, some water left over, and some bacteria. So the mass of feces that you produce is partially just gut bacteria that are coming out. That material is then collected in the rectum, which then stretches out, and that stretch is sensed by our body and tells us that it's time to expel these feces. So when we get to a place where we've decided it's acceptable to expel feces, we allow the anal sphincters to open, and contractions in the large intestine, sometimes aided by contractions of the abdominal muscle, push those feces out and we defecate. So that's the sort of general overview. In our next bit here, we're going to talk about motility patterns in the digestive system, how we control those, some of the different kinds of smooth muscle contraction we use. And then in the second lecture of the digestive system, we're going to go back over all of that process, except in more detail. We'll talk about what's in the saliva and what's in the stomach secretions and how we control them and all of that stuff. So I'll see you in just a moment to talk about digestive motility.